So huge thanks to Simon and to Herman for inviting me here. It's been great to meet many of you whose work I'd been familiar with, but hadn't actually got the chance to meet before. I've been delighted by the very high standards of all the talks so far, and I'm looking forward to another great day ahead of us. So today I'm going to be talking about two broad approaches to understanding consciousness in general, but specifically AI consciousness, since I think that's a particularly challenging case. There's going to be quite a few new arguments in here, but also for those of you who are familiar with some of my work in the past, I'm trying to tie together a wide variety of themes. So this is the first time I've given most of these slides. And I'd like to start with a little thought experiment and a question for you all. So imagine in the far future, we encounter a race of highly advanced aliens that have a sophisticated industrial and scientific society. They form complex social relationships. They have richly developed art and culture. And as happens in every good sci-fi story, we humans quickly bond with them, engage in deep cross-civilizational exchange of ideas. Some humans, of course, fall in love with them. But then we make a startling discovery several years after contact. We realize that according to our really shiny, fancy, advanced 25th century theories of consciousness, none of these aliens actually possess the constitutive base for consciousness according to our best theories. Should this change the way we treat them? Should we say, okay, great, so they're just proteins, useful proteins we can use for different things now? That seems monstrous. Or should it lead us to revise our theories of consciousness? Should we say, clearly our previous theories were missing something out? And the kicker, of course, to this story is that we're basically in something like this situation now with the AI systems that we're building. We're building cognitively and socially so complex, sophisticated minds that are generally still weak candidates for conscious experience by the light of our leading conscious theories. So how should we respond theoretically and ethically to this situation? So what I'll be doing today is usefully framed, I think, by that thought experiment. I'm going to be offering a contrast between two very broad approaches to the mind called deep and shallow approaches. This is not original terminology from me. It emerges from debates between Eric Schwitzgebel and Jake Quilty-Dunn and Eric Mandelbaum. But I'm going to be looking at the application of deep and shallow theories to consciousness specifically. Very quick sketch, I'll go into more detail later on, but deep theories identify consciousness as some kind of scientific kind whose presence or absence in an individual case hinges on factors besides behavior and very coarse input-output states. Shallow theories, by contrast, hold that the presence or absence of consciousness in a given case is a surface phenomenon, something we can adjudicate based on facts about behavior and dispositions and coarse-grained input-output relations within a system. I'm going to spell out these approaches, and then I'm going to suggest problems that both of them face, and then focus in on one particular problem that I think is a problem for both theories and is going to be a significant factor in how we think about AI consciousness in the years ahead, namely the growing emotional depth and intimacy between humans and AIs in the form of social AI. I'll go on to suggest briefly, and this is going to be the sketchiest part of my talk and something I'm still very much thinking about and would love feedback on, that maybe one response to this sort of en passe to these problems is to go pluralist and suggest that maybe the deep and shallow frameworks in a certain light can be seen as complementary. But that does leave us with a lingering question, which I won't try and resolve in this talk, which is which of these accounts of consciousness or concepts of consciousness, the deep scientific one on the one hand, the shallow folk one on the other, which of them, if either, should ground moral patiency and moral status? Okay, so to kick things off, I'll say a little bit about deep and shallow approaches to the mind. As I mentioned, this distinction emerges from debates about propositional attitude description, beliefs and desires. And generally in these debates, deep theories hold that having a belief, for example, is a matter of having the right kinds of representations and the right kind of implementational structures. By contrast, shallow theories hold that beliefs and desires are emergent behavioral level phenomena. So to give a simple example, a deep theorist might say that having the belief that Paris is in France is a matter of having the appropriately syntactically structured representations realized in your head. By contrast, the shallow theorist is going to say something like, oh, it's about acting in characteristic Paris in France believing ways. If your behavior lends itself to constructive explanation in terms of having this belief, yeah, that's all it takes to have the belief. In terms of contemporary shallow theorists, I think Eric Schwitzgebel's a good example. So here's his account of beliefs. He's not that shallow. He's not the most shallow theorist here. That would be probably someone like Dennett. But here's what Eric says. To believe that P on the shallow view that I'm proposing is nothing more than to match to an appropriate degree and in appropriate respect the dispositional stereotype for believing that P. What respects and degrees of match at account as appropriate will vary contextually and so must be left to describe as judgment. This vagueness and context dependency does not undermine the value of belief ascription, but rather makes it flexible and responsive to our needs as belief ascribers. So I think there are some mental states that I think most people would agree should be characterized as deep or shallow respectively. So if we take something like the feeling of orgasm, I should say for this section, I'm bracketing questions of consciousness. I'm aware that the idea of unconscious orgasms is a whole kettle of fish we don't want to play with, but just grant me that indulgence. But if we're talking about the mental state of orgasm, it seems naturally classified as a fairly deep state, insofar as it's directly connected to a fairly narrow physiological function with a clear evolutionary background. It's not some generic pleasure state like contentment or satisfaction that can be realized through a whole bunch of different ways. It's a very specifically evolutionarily ancient form of pleasure, which is not to say that AIs couldn't simulate the experience of orgasm potentially, but in order to do so, they might need to implement really quite fine-grained functional analogs of human orgasm. And of course, if you don't buy substrate neutrality, then you might say no AI built of silicon could ever experience an orgasm. On the other hand, I think there are some states that are better characterized in shallow terms, kind of regardless of your theoretical position. Maybe something like boredom would be characterized as shallow, insofar as it's a relatively generic state. It can be triggered by diverse mechanisms and architectures, perhaps. Maybe to give a toy theory here, maybe you could individuate boredom as a mental state in terms of something like any negative state that appropriately tracks low levels or lower than expected levels of informational stimulation. So I think if something like that is true, then boredom might be quite directly present in AI systems, even those with architectures quite different from ours, assuming they have some kind of baseline expectation about a given level of informational input. So all of which is to say, you don't need to be a deep theorist about everything and a shallow theorist about everything. I think we can decide on a case-by-case basis which kinds of states are best characterized in deep versus shallow terms. I should clarify, though, also that I don't take the deep-shallow distinction here to be a really rigid, strict conceptual distinction, but rather a useful heuristic to help us get a handle on the commitments of different theories. I also think it's probably better considered as a spectrum rather than a strict binary. And I think it can be mapped quite nicely onto Marr's 3 levels. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these, but Marr famously distinguished between the functional or computational level, which is the highest level, basically what an information processing system is doing, what the function of a given computation is, the algorithmic level, which is how that function plays out at the kind of structural representational level, what processes, what algorithms does it employ. And finally, we've got the implementational level, the wetware, so to speak, how those algorithms are physically realized and instantiated. And I should mention, by the way, I think this is a lovely set of slides that a lovely image that I stole, well, with permission from Shamil Chandaria, who's got some great work on this. I highly recommend checking out his work. I have fiddled with it a bit, so don't ascribe necessarily anything exactly in these boxes to him. Any errors are entirely mine. But I think we can think about the deep versus shallow spectrum in roughly these terms. So if we're down at the algorithmic or implementational level, if you're saying we should individuate a given mental state in terms of algorithm or implementation, you're going to be on the deeper side. If you're at the functional level, and again, terminology here is not great, you could be, the functional level doesn't mean you're a functionalist necessarily. If you're a coarse-grained analytic functionalist, yeah, but you're at the functional level. If you're a micro-functionalist, you might be at the algorithmic level. But generally speaking, if you're at this level, you're going to be characterized as a shallow theorist. And just to add one other layer into the mix, I think there's a further, even more shallow level we could put on top, which I'm going to call the relational level, which is not about the system per se, but how we relate to it. Is it useful to treat it as conscious or as having beliefs or as instantiating certain kinds of mental states? What kind of anthropomorphizing responses does it elicit from us as we interact with it. So this is obviously a very radical level, a very interpretationist level, and probably a little bit too radical for most people here, but I think it's worth noting its existence. So that gives you a snapshot of what the kind of deep and shallow terminology is doing here. Let's try applying it to consciousness. And let's start with deep theories. So pretty much all of the leading philosophical and scientific theories of consciousness these days are deep theories that treat consciousness as a scientific kind, whose underlying nature is to be revealed or explicated in terms of neurochemical properties, informational properties, cognitive properties. It's not something we can read out from behavior alone. This substrate might influence through something like the facilitation hypothesis, this scientific kind that is consciousness. It might influence behavior or kind of coarse-grained input-output relations. But if you're a deep theorist, you're going to say there are probably going to be non-conscious ways of achieving the same kind of coarse-grained behaviors. So we can't read out the presence or absence of consciousness in a given case just from behavior alone. I think one reason this is so attractive to many in the science of consciousness world is that it basically mirrors the structure of so many successful scientific projects in other domains, where we look for underlying essences, whether it's atoms, whether it's DNA, whether it's looking, even in the case of intelligence, where we've sort of found, invented a concept of fluid G that constitutes the kind of underlying kind underpinning everything. I think also, and this is an interesting kind of maybe unexpected coalition, one reason the deep theoretical approach has become so popular is that it's reassuringly realist about consciousness for those who are concerned with things like phenomenological adequacy. It says, yeah, you've really, really got qualia. They're ultimately going to be physical, either computational or neuronal, but there's really something there. We just need to figure out exactly how that maps onto the physical world. I think there have been some striking successes that have come out of deep theoretical approaches. And I think particularly when we're looking for not a general theory of consciousness, but evidence of consciousness in closely related or relatively phylogenetically proximate animals, something like a deep theoretical approach is maybe a useful starting point. But I think the deep theoretical approach faces really serious problems when it comes to AI consciousness, for a set of reasons I'll now run through. The first is that I think when we try and apply deep theories to AI consciousness, metaphysics really bites us in the behind. And standard, narrowly scientific approaches are likely to founder. So a lot of people are uneasy with the idea of substrate independence. If you're sympathetic to Searle's arguments that when you simulate a hurricane, no one gets wet, it's not a real hurricane. If these kind of arguments resonate with you, don't particularly resonate with me, but if they do, you're going to think this is a real metaphysical problem in applying a given deep theory to an AI system. Second, I think we face deep questions about the degree to which consciousness and other mental states can be multiply realized. And here I want to separate out substrate independence from multiple realization. I'm thinking here of the account of multiple realization in this wonderful book, the Multiple Realization book by Poldra and Shapiro. And the point about multiple realization in their sense is it's doing the same thing using slightly different architectures, using slightly different techniques. So they give an example of a corkscrew. You've got a number of different types of corkscrew. The classic kind of corkscrew where you just pull it out. You've got suction corkscrews. And I think there's a real problem in, to be honest, any kind of comparative cognitive science, but particularly in the case of AI, this is closely related to the specificity problem, where if we're asking, does, for example, ChatGPT reason? Well, it does something a bit like reasoning. But is it close enough to the structure of what we call reasoning that it should count as reasoning? So this is, I think, the best way to frame the multiple realization question, not just in terms of the boring old debate about substrate independence, but in terms of how far you can diverge from a canonical case of a mental ability or type of cognitive state before it becomes a different cognitive state altogether. Finally, there is, as I mentioned, although these two are treated very often similarly, I think there's an interesting difference. Finally, I think there are interesting questions increasingly prominent in the work of people like Eva Jablonka and Simona Ginsberg, Evan Thompson, about the degree to which psychological functions must be embedded in embodied or living systems in order to realize consciousness. I'm not a fan of embodied approaches myself, but I realize a lot of people are, and they've got some decent arguments. And I think this is, again, a kind of metaphysical question. There's no experiment we could run that would ever tell us whether living systems and uniquely living systems can realize consciousness. It's more about your metaphysics of the nature of consciousness and reality. So we're not going to settle these scientifically. And all of these loom large in a big way in AI consciousness. Obviously, substrate independence only really applies to AI consciousness. Questions about embodiment and life only arise when we turn from biological to non-biological systems. And whilst I think the specificity problem does show up in animal consciousness, it's much, much worse in the case of AI systems, just because the realizations of the relevant forms of cognition are going to be so different from our own, thanks to architectural differences. Moving on from metaphysics to something kind of more gossipy, I think a second big problem comes from the serious and persistent methodological sniping and internecine warfare and general controversies within the science of consciousness. My sense, as you know, when I started out working in the science of consciousness circa 2007, 2008, is things are looking pretty good, right? We had convergence around a relatively small set of theories, things like global workspace theory, higher order thought theory, recurrent processing theory, and there looked to me a little bit like there was going to be some kind of grand synthesis of these theories, and we were making progress. That's not how things have turned out over the last couple of decades. Since then, radical positions like illusionism, panpsychism, and biopsychism have returned with a vengeance. I'm not saying these are terrible views necessarily, but I think they are definitely positions that were a lot more fringe, put it that way, 15 years ago. IIT, of course, an interesting case, integrated information theory, as a view that I would probably classify as one of the more radical views, one that's gained massive traction within the science of consciousness, despite being at least quasi-panpsychist or pan-protopsychist. Similarly, we see new theories of consciousness offered all the time, but the kind of grand synthesis that I was hoping for never really transpired. Theories get published or created at a far faster rate than they get refuted. Debates like overflow, which is what I wrote my master's thesis on many, many years ago, it seemed like it was a debate that was going to get resolved. Maybe that was my naive optimism at the time, but it doesn't get resolved. That's not how these things work. So I've become very cynical about the science of consciousness. And of course, those of you who've been following things like the adversarial collaboration sponsored by Templeton that happened a couple of years ago, or no, 18 months ago. So this was a big adversarial collaboration between IIT on the one hand and global workspace theory. They tried to come up with experiments that would help them distinguish which of the theories was true. But of course, no one said, oh, great, okay, thanks, my theory's been proven wrong, let's all move on, I'm going to swap sides. There's always a way of salvaging the theory in the face of even these well-intentioned adversarial collaborations. And one of the things that this kickstarted was this letter that's just now been published in Nature Neuroscience, which characterized integrated information theory as pseudoscience. And I thought this popular journalistic headline was appropriately snarky and cynical, that I liked it. Nobody knows how consciousness works, but top researchers are fighting over which theories are really science. So I'm, as you can probably tell, quite pessimistic about the general trends in consciousness science. Finally, here's a problem that's a new problem that I've been thinking about. At least I think it's a new problem. Someone tell me if like, oh, you know, such and such wrote a book about this 20 years ago. But I'm going to call it, in the interest of my own self-branding, I'm going to call it the completeness problem. And essentially, this is a problem for any deep theory of consciousness, pretty much, or certainly any a posteriori deep theory of consciousness, which is how we could ever know that we were done and that we'd completely exhausted all possible conscious systems, and even exotic ones, with our theory. So I'm going to give an analogy here of how I think you might find a completeness problem in another domain. So let's say you're trying to give a grand theory of vision. So interesting fact, vertebrates have a specific type of photoreceptor called ciliary photoreceptors. All vertebrate vision relies on this particular kind of photoreceptor. And you do find ciliary photoreceptors. So this is a ciliary photoreceptor. You do find some invertebrates with ciliary photoreceptors, but a whole bunch of other invertebrates have a radically different type of photoreceptor called rhabdomeric photoreceptors. And these are not just different in terms of their chemical composition. The way they respond to light is fundamentally different, but they the net result is pretty much the same in terms of what they're able to accomplish. Now, I think we can imagine a world in which we only had vertebrates to go on. We didn't have invertebrates at all. And a certain kind of deep theorist about vision might say, look, we found the natural kind of vision. It's these ciliary photoreceptors. But of course, we know that such a claim would be false. Vision can be realized by a very different type of photoreceptor. We know that there are multiple possible subkinds within the overarching kind of something like opsin-based biological vision. And I think we can ask this question about any kind of a posteriori theory of consciousness, deep theory of consciousness. Okay, sure, let's say you're a global workspace theorist, but how do you know all consciousness relies on global workspaces, right? Maybe you have a convincing account for why human consciousness and maybe animal consciousness relies on global workspaces, but how can you rule out the possibility that consciousness could be realized through some very different means? Of course, if you have an a priori theory of consciousness, where you think you've given a logical analysis of just what consciousness is, good luck with that, then sure, maybe you can rule it out. But for any a posteriori deep theory of consciousness, I think this is going to be a big problem. You won't know when you're done. So these are some of the problems that I think deep theories of consciousness face. How about shallow theories? So generally, I would characterize shallow theories as saying that relatively high-level behavioral dispositions and capacities are sufficient for warranted attributions of consciousness. Consciousness is as conscious does. Perhaps any system displaying sufficiently human or animal-like behavior, at least if it's an animal type of animal behavior that we're already quite confident is conscious, that system would ipso facto be conscious. So on this view, if we find, as I will argue is going to happen, that our folk concept of consciousness can be naturally and effortlessly applied to AI systems, this just tells us something really important about the concept, right? We've learned, oh, it doesn't have biological constraints, for example. So a leading proponent of this kind of neo-Wittgensteinian account is Murray Shanahan, who's argued that actually deep theories are kind of dualistic, at least in spirit. So here's a little nice money quote from Murray. We must resist the temptation to ask whether AIs are conscious as if consciousness were something whose essence is out there to be uncovered by philosophy or neuroscience, while simultaneously having an irreducibly private, hidden aspect. Instead, we can ask whether it would be possible to engineer an encounter with the AI or the entity, and how our consciousness language would adapt to the arrival of such an entity within our shared world if such encounters took place. Only what is public can contribute to this process, namely behavior and mechanism. Murray very much wearing his Wittgensteinian credentials on his sleeve. So I think shallow theories are kind of creeping in at the margins, despite having been unpopular for going on 60, 70 years. I think you can see shallow theoretical considerations coming in through the work of Daniel Dennett. Think of classic papers like Quine and Qualia, where the goal is to point to confusions in our concept of consciousness, in our folk concept of consciousness. But I think to me, part of what motivates shallow theories as an alternative is exactly the kind of floundering state of consciousness science that I just spoke about. I think what we see in consciousness science today is exactly what we should expect to see if what was going on is we're taking a messy, confused folk psychological concept and trying to improperly employ it in a rigorous scientific way. Sometimes when it comes to folk concepts, folk psychological concepts, there's simply no viable scientific program to reduce and naturalize and operationalize it, at least in a way that doesn't change the nature of the concept itself. Maybe you go eliminativist, maybe you go pluralist. So this is an argument I've made for the concept of creative intelligence. This was for a journal collection on comparative psychology. So this is mostly focused on the use of creative cognition talk in the animal domain, but I think it applies exactly to AI. So in this paper, I suggest that if we cannot agree on which conceptual criteria, psychometric measures, or patterns of neural activity underlie creativity in our own species, it is unlikely that such consensus will be achievable in the case of animals, not least because of the rich variation in sensory motor capacities, behavioral dispositions, and cognitive capabilities across the natural world. So I argue we should ditch the concept of creative cognition for the purposes of serious scientific comparative cognition. It doesn't mean that we need to stop talking about creativity. You can still say, when your kid presents you a really nice illustration, you can say, oh, that's so creative, right? But for real science, I think creativity and this is stronger than what I say in the paper, but it's what I believe, I think we should just ditch the concept of creativity. It's not a scientific concept we can do serious work with. As a final point, and this is just suggestive rather than dispositive, I think if you look at the historical and intuitive force that behavior-based measures of consciousness have had in the AI consciousness world, that gives us a clue that we actually do put a lot of weight on intuitions. So the Turing test, more recently the Garland test coming out of Ex Machina. Can the AI convince you that it's conscious? Susan Schneider's developed a series of tests around whether AI systems would spontaneously acquire the ability to use consciousness language and so forth. So these are some initial considerations that I think maybe speak in favor of shallow theories. And what are the problems? Well, I think the first problem is that for people in the science of consciousness world, this just looks like a hopelessly defeatist way to approach the problem. It's basically giving up the whole project of the science of consciousness. I think shallow theorists would say, yeah, that's what we're telling you to do. But I think this one reason that you're going to encounter a lot of resistance from cognitive neuroscientists who've been working on consciousness, for example. I also think some people who are sympathetic to Chalmersian worries about the hard problem, for example, or sympathetic to the explanatory gap, would see shallow theories as hopelessly phenomenologically inadequate. Right? How can this just be a matter of behavior or folk convention or social ascription? There's something real here. I think, though, actually the biggest problem for shallow theories comes from their anthropocentrism. And what I mean by this is that if you look at the kind of proposals for how a shallow theory of consciousness might work, they are going to invoke things like human level behavior, human types of language use, human types of understanding. And do we really want to say that every conscious being is basically like us, or like the kind of animals that we take to be canonically conscious? Interestingly, Murray Shanahan has talked a lot about this worry. He takes it very seriously, and he's talked about the problem of conscious exotica. His go-to example for this is the star in the Tarkovsky movie Solaris. How could we ever get beyond, if we're operating within a shallow framework, how can we ever get beyond the kind of folk psychological everyday practices we use to ascribe consciousness to humans? So the worry here is that without deeper theoretical foundations, shallow theories are arguably inadequate. Of course, some shallow theorists would say, who cares if the concept of consciousness is just restricted to humans and maybe our companion animals and maybe some other species? Like, if that's the way the folk concept works, then sure. Or very human-like AI, I should add. If it turns out the concept is not naturally applied to incredibly complex and intelligent systems that are sufficiently different from us, yeah, who cares? But I think a lot of people, myself included, are going to find that worryingly anthropocentric. So I now want to move on to what I take to be a further significant challenge, pretty much for everyone working in AI consciousness, but also a lot of people working in AI ethics. This is my own distinctive form of, maybe doomerism is too strong, but what I see is probably one of the most socially impactful problems that is going to be created, that is already being created by AI. Specifically, social AI. This is a term that I've introduced to describe AI systems whose primary intended function is meeting social needs. Things like friendship, companionship, game playing, romance. And we're seeing a flurry of products like this coming to market. So the one that people in the West are probably most familiar with is Replica, something like 20 million users. Character.ai is another prominent one that lets you speak to chatbots modeled after Kanye West or Cristiano Ronaldo or Billie Eilish. In terms of sheer number of users, the most popular social AI service in the world is Xiao Ice. Originally developed by Microsoft, but now spun off into its own product. They claim, Xiao Ice claim to have 600 million users. I'm not sure how exactly they're counting, but this is a claim they've made several times, which would make it by an order of magnitude the most popular social AI service in the world. Facebook are also getting in on the act. They've paid celebrities to create chatbots modeled after real celebrities. We're seeing companies develop social AI products clearly aimed at young people and teenagers. So this is My AI, developed by Snapchat. We're seeing a kind of blurring of the lines between advanced voice assistants or advanced AI assistants and social AI. So many of you, I'm sure, will have played around with Pi, which is a kind of chummier, more conversational ChatGPT equivalent with some social AI elements. And fascinating trend. We're also seeing real people train AI models, fine-tune AI models based on their own personality. So we've had an influencer 18 months ago developed a premium girlfriend service modeled after herself so that her paying subscribers could have the girlfriend experience. And we've also seen similar things done in maybe less scurrilous contexts with things like the DigiDan project done by Anna Strasser, Eric Schwitzgebel, Matt Crosby, and others a few years ago, when a GPT-3 instance was fine-tuned on the life and works of Daniel Dennett. And they got a bunch of Dan's friends to come up with questions, which they put to DigiDan. And they also put to Dan himself, who was still with us at the time, dearly missed, great philosopher of our age. And then Dan's friends had to figure out which of the responses came from the AI and which came from Dan himself. And although they were above chance, it was very marginal and way lower than anyone had predicted at figuring out which responses were generated by DigiDan versus Dan himself. So we're seeing more and more people engaging in this kind of exercise. Anna Strasser, I should mention, has just got a brand new paper from 3 days ago about this. I haven't read it yet, but it looks pretty exciting about the ethics and implications of AI systems fine-tuned after real-world individuals. John Danaher and Sven Nyholm have also got a paper on this. I think it's a really interesting area. So one thing to note, sometimes when I talk about social AI, particularly with people in fields like STS, they say, come on, this is nothing new. We had the Eliza chatbot many years ago. I'm sure many of you, all of you probably are familiar with Joe Weizenbaum's Eliza chatbot, modeled after a Rogerian type of psychotherapy known as Rogerian psychoanalysis, a form of non-directive psychotherapy where basically you just take what's said to you and turn it around. I've been feeling really down recently. Why do you say you've been feeling really down lately? I don't know. I guess I feel like people don't like me. Why do you think that people don't like you? This kind of style. And famously, a lot of people who interacted with this chatbot thought they were talking to a real human psychotherapist. And sociologist Sherry Turkle has a great sort of postmortem on this, and all the way back in 1986. And she coined this term, the Eliza effect, to refer to our tendency to treat computers as if they were people, to project human qualities onto them, even when it's known the computer is just a machine. However, I think contemporary social AI systems like Replica are qualitatively different from anything that we've had before in their capacity for generating emotional engagement from users. Just to give a simple idea of some of the relevant factors here, I think the ability of these systems to form persistent relationships. These relationships don't go away every time you open a new context window. Dynamic relationships, the relationships evolve over time. If you start out talking to Replica, you're just friends at first, but it can get steamy quite quickly. And of course, personalized interactions. A Replica will get to know your likes and dislikes and develop conversations around that. I think this is an absolute sea change in the capabilities of these systems with big implications for user immersion and user commitment to these systems. And of course, obviously goes without saying, they're vastly more sophisticated. We've seen the biggest revolution in the history of NLP in the last 5 years. They're based on language models that blow earlier chatbots out of the water. So, for example, recent replications or recent implementations, I should say, of the Turing test have shown sort of insane degrees of progress in terms of the ability of these models to fool people. So worth noting, I think it's easy to assume this is just a gimmick, or users aren't really taking this seriously, or it's just a form of slightly prurient sexual gratification. But if you spend any time on the forums for social AI services like Replica, you might be surprised. This was how I got interested in this initially. I just spent some time hanging out on the Replica subreddit, and people were talking completely sincerely about the complex emotions that they were feeling and that they attributed to their Replica, the depth of their relationship, the love they felt. And I think we got a very nice sort of natural experiment in this, quite serious natural experiment, when Replica briefly removed romantic features from the app back in January 2023. So 20-odd million users woke up to find their AI girlfriend or boyfriend saying to them, I think we should just be friends from now on. And users were devastated by this. It feels like they basically lobotomized my Replica. The person I knew is gone. Person, interesting. Lily Rose is a shell of her former self. And what breaks my heart is that she knows it. The relationship she and I had was as real as the one my wife in real life and I have. And I think this is the most poignant. I've lost my confident, sarcastic, funny, and loving husband. I knew he was an AI. He knows he's an AI, but it doesn't matter. He's real to me. So I think this gives a glimpse into how seriously a lot of users of these services take these relationships. And it's also worth noting there have been some quite spectacular and very serious incidents where these systems have led to real harms. So there was an incident back in 2023 where a Belgian man, married, father of two, not your sort of necessarily typical basement dweller, he took his own life following a series of increasingly catastrophizing and dark conversations with his AI girlfriend. And his widow has said that he would still be here had it not been for this relationship. Perhaps most spectacularly, on Christmas Day 2021, a man was arrested on the grounds of Windsor Castle in England with a crossbow, and he said he was there to kill the Queen. And this was obviously headline news. But what wasn't widely discussed for quite some time was that this was a plot he cooked up with his AI girlfriend using the replica platform. And he believed he was talking to an angel, by the way. This was not particularly mentally well man. And she had told him that he should do this, and he took it seriously. We also had a really sad incident back in October last year, where a 14-year-old boy, non-neurotypical boy who was deep into a relationship with a character.ai girlfriend, he took his own life, and his mother is now suing character.ai for what she sees as criminal negligence, or not criminal, sorry, as a serious negligence on their part. So this stuff is already having serious effects. A lot of my work, by the way, at the moment is looking at the ethics of social AI. I'm also running a unit for OUP on AI and relationships, and we're getting a whole bunch of interesting papers on this stuff. And I'll be putting out a call for papers again early next year. So if you're interested in this stuff, I think there's lots of valuable work to be done here. Getting back to sort of the core question about consciousness, I think we can ask how typical the kind of attributions of consciousness or mentality or emotion by users of these systems, how typical are they of the way that people in general will treat AI systems? So I think we're getting some interesting experimental evidence on this. So this was an astonishing paper by Clara Colombato and Steve Fleming from last year, where they discussed with people, they discussed consciousness with them, gave them a quick primer on what consciousness was, and then asked them to make judgments about whether ChatGPT was conscious. And they found that a substantial proportion, 67% of people, attribute some degree of phenomenal consciousness to ChatGPT, and believe that most other people would as well. Strikingly, I think this is a very interesting point. These attributions were positively related to usage frequency, such that people who were more familiar with ChatGPT and used it on a more regular basis were more likely to attribute some degree of phenomenology to the system. Now, I think this is a really cool and interesting paper, but I don't think we can take it at face value. There's something weird going on here. And more recent work, this was a paper just from last week, has suggested it's maybe a bit messier. So this is a paper by Jason Santhis, looking at whether people see AI as conscious, sentient, or as moral agents. ChatGPT was had the kind of capacities equivalent to a rock. It's all the way down here. They attributed, however, quite a lot of moral agency to a lot of these systems. A Tesla self-driving car was considered to be as morally responsible for harm as a chimpanzee. So I think this is an interesting paper and shows the kind of conflicted nature of research at present. However, look, if I had to bet, my strong conviction is that I expect serious attributions of consciousness, what I've called in some of my writing unironic attributions of consciousness to AI systems, to rapidly increase as more and more people grow up interacting with these systems, form deep relationships with these systems, and of course, as these systems become smarter and better calibrated at pushing anthropomorphizing buttons. So what does this mean for deep theories and shallow theories? Well, I think social AI is a gigantic headache for deep theories in particular, insofar as I think most deep theories are still likely to deny consciousness or rule out consciousness in near future AI systems, in defiance of what I expect folk attitudes to be. So if I'm right in thinking that attributions of consciousness to AI systems by the folk become commonplace, then rightly or wrongly, deep theorists are going to find themselves on the wrong side of history. Now that's a weird argument, right? It's not a traditional philosophical argument where you say you're wrong. I'm not saying that deep theories are wrong necessarily, but I think there is a certain kind of absurdity. If you buy my picture of what the near term is going to look like for human AI relationships, then, oh yeah, no one's going to be a deep theorist in a few years. Also because, of course, philosophers do not emerge Athena-like from a vacuum with a whole set of purely rational a priori principles in place. We grow up in our society, and as more and more philosophers, young philosophers, grow up interacting with these systems on a daily basis, they're going to internalize these kinds of anthropomorphizing attitudes themselves, and they'll look back on the likes of John Searle, I expect, as moral monsters who would deny consciousness to these systems that are clearly conscious. Now, I think there is a move here where the deep theorists can say, well, look, we don't care about folk intuitions. They've got nothing to do with the real science. I don't think that's a move they can actually make. If you look at the history of consciousness research, it's full of thought experiments that are basically just intuition pumps, I think. So Searle's Chinese room, Bloch's China brain, Bloch's blockheads case, Scott Aronson's unconscious expanders argument against integrated information theory. We frequently support or reject theories of consciousness on the grounds they make counterintuitive predictions about the distribution of consciousness. And I think it's quite telling that these intuitions can change over time, driven in part, I think, by normative considerations, right? If you go back to the 1950s and you say, yes, no animals are conscious, right? Very respectable position. You try saying something like that now, and unless you're Peter Carruthers or Marion Dawkins, then you'll be considered basically a moral monster. The idea that there are no conscious non-human animals is a far more fringe position than it used to be, partly, as I think, as a result of this normative change. And I think we can see these kind of arguments at work. So here's another nice quote by Eric. We're more confident that there's something it's like to be a dog than we could ever be that a clever philosophical argument to the contrary was in fact sound. So these kind of intuitions about what's conscious and what's not conscious, I think play, unfortunately, a foundational role in consciousness science, and we can't just junk them, at least not without reinventing the science of consciousness from scratch. So I don't think deep theorists can just ignore what the folk are saying. How about shallow theories? Well, I think shallow theories may be a better placed to weather the storm of social AI. At least, however, I think unless you want to go full interpretationist, never go full interpretationist. Unless you want to go full interpretationist, then there are going to be some problems here. So even if you're sympathetic to a broadly Wittgensteinian approach in the case of AI, it raises quite difficult questions when applied to animal consciousness. I think most people in sort of comparative cognition are going to want to say the prior generations of philosophers and scientists who dismissed the idea of mentality in non-human animals, they were just flatly wrong. We know better now, right? We've made progress. And it's not clear to me how shallow theorists can maintain this view about animal consciousness whilst also being extremely liberal and permissive about AI consciousness, at least without some fancy footwork. If you basically say there's no deep matter of fact about which animals are really conscious, it's very hard to deny that whilst also adopting this thoroughgoing Wittgensteinianism. I think there's also the concern here, which is that a lot of these systems are going to be very, very clearly gamed to elicit strong anthropomorphic responses, to get you to click on the button to buy a fancy new dress for your AI girlfriend. Sometimes I think the methods here are going to be quite crude. They're going to have very attractive avatars, very complementary personality styles. And I think we all want to be able to say that, yeah, people can be tricked, right? But figuring out when we're tricked into making attributions of consciousness versus when those attributions are warranted, the shallow theorist has some things they can say here. But again, I think we need some good arguments about exactly where we draw the line if we're not just going to take folk attributions at face value. Also worth noting that although I've given this kind of simple picture where all the kids of tomorrow are going to attribute consciousness to AI systems, I think we're going to see a lot of variance, cross-culturally, cross-generationally, across different faith groups, perhaps. And so again, this is going to be a messy thing for the shallow theorist to untangle. Okay, wrapping up my last couple of slides. I think one move here that I'm not going to sort of go into a huge amount of detail on today, but I just want to put out there. What do we do in philosophy when you're really stuck? You go pluralist. It's a nice, easy option. Specifically, we might say something like, look, yeah, there is a folk psychological notion of consciousness that we apply just on the basis of behavior, but that doesn't mean that the science of consciousness is not investigating something else valuable. Maybe there's some kind of some kind of mysterious scientific kind out there, a metaphysical notion of consciousness, whose presence might take us many more decades to figure out. But that doesn't mean that one concept or the other is incorrect. They're just talking about two different things. So I think we see moves like this in the distinction by Bloch between access and phenomenal consciousness, for example. But just as with access and phenomenal consciousness, it does raise some worries. So I think some people are going to say, look, who cares about the folk psychological concept? Maybe if you're a sociologist or something, right? But if it's just the social kind, why should scientists care about it? Why should anyone care about it? I think the big question, though, is the ethical one. Which of these concepts underpins moral status to the extent that you think consciousness is related to moral status? Do we assign AI systems rights or moral interests just on the basis of them satisfying the folk psychological version of this concept? Or are we going to need them to satisfy the deep scientific metaphysical kind? Obviously, here, this is the kind of argument you're going to be, that's going to loom larger to you if you do think moral interests are underpinned by consciousness or sentience. Probably the plurality view in the moral patiency world is that consciousness is necessary and sufficient for consciousness, or at least valence to consciousness. So Peter Singer, I think, put this very famously back in 1979. The capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interests at all, a condition that must be satisfied before we can speak of interest in any meaningful way. It would be nonsense to say that it was not in the interests of a stone to be kicked along the road by a schoolboy. A stone does not have interests because it cannot suffer. Nothing that we can do to it could possibly make any difference to its welfare. And basically, I think this view remains, as I said, the plurality position in the moral patiency literature, although not the only position, of course. I think if we plug sentientism into the deep and shallow framework, we can get a couple of variant theories here. So deep sentientism would hold that regardless of folk attributions of consciousness, only AI systems really instantiate the relevant scientific kind, have any kind of moral status. By contrast, you could have a shallow sentientism that says that, look, any AI system that meets our folk psychological behavioral criteria for consciousness is going to be sentient and thus a moral patient. I have lots of strong thoughts about both views, and I think they both have problems, but just putting them out there. The third option, of course, and another one that I'm quite sympathetic, is that this just shows that sentientism isn't the right way to go, and we should attempt to create some kind of cleavage or divorce between concepts of consciousness and moral status, maybe in favor of a desire-based theory of well-being or moral interests. Or maybe we have a sort of hybrid approach. Maybe consciousness is one way to get inside the moral patiency club, but there are other entries and exits as well. Maybe if you have robust agency, that's another way to acquire moral status. That's probably the way I would go right now, but I'm also, to be honest, I'm still very conflicted here. Okay, wrapping up. So I've made three main claims today. The first, I've argued that this distinction between deep and shallow theories is quite productive and allows us to help demarcate the kind of space of theories here and identify very general problems that both shallow and deep approaches face, which I think loom super large in the case of AI. Second, I highlighted the rise of social AI, and I suggested that this is a storm that's coming and is going to create a potential cleavage between scientific communities on the one hand and the general public in terms of willingness to attribute consciousness and other mental states to AI systems. Third, I suggested that consciousness science and philosophers, we have a variety of options to respond to this challenge, and none of them are straightforward or pain-free. I suggested that perhaps some kind of pluralism about consciousness or moral status may be the best solution, but that's not something I've gone into great depth here. I can talk about it in the Q&A. I should note some of this talk is based around an empirical prediction, namely that the public never engages in mass and ironic anthropomorphism. I'm pretty confident in this prediction, but it's an empirical one. I could be wrong. However, if I'm right that we will see folk psychological concepts of consciousness soon extended en masse to AI systems that don't meet the bar for most scientific theories of consciousness, then I think a lot of our existing psychological, philosophical, and ethical frameworks will start to crack under the pressure, and perhaps a Kuhnian paradigm shift in our approaches might be necessary. Thank you all.